This is Melbourne. If you live in Melbourne, you might know it, but for those who don't, Melbourne is a city, as indicated by the tall rectangles. The city is known for its trams, shit coffee that's somehow good, and for being a little brother of Sydney. Melbourne also has the biggest university and shopping centre in the Southern Hemisphere. But to be fair, the rest of the Southern Hemisphere is New Zealand, Argentina, the country that exports all the copper, the bottom of Africa, and all the islands. It's not much of a competition. Of course, Melbourne is served by trains, more trains than a lot of cities, especially American ones. One of the first electric trains to enter service was the Tate set. These trains entered service as soon as the network was electrified and wore a black and white livery for decades, at least before colour was invented. Unfortunately, these trains were not immune to Stegosaurus attacks. To this day, scratch marks are still visible on carriage 286M. The inside of the trains were designed for the Queen of England, having fancy blue seats, lights that aren't fluorescent, and picture frames on the walls. Passengers would stare at these pictures because they didn't have mobile phones or Nintendos. These trains had a very impressive service life, running since electrification in the Stone Age. They ran in service until they were withdrawn for the super train, which I'll get to in a minute. There is another train that entered electric service parallel to the Tate sets, and they were called swing doors. Well, obviously the doors swing, it's in the name. But on the outside they look similar, but on the inside they look like completely different trains. Who would have thought? One of the differences on the outside is that the swing door trains have a smaller loading gauge. To those of you who aren't yada nerds, loading gauge is basically the rough outline of the train. Swing door trains are shorter and narrower, which worried early passengers that the train might be blown away in the wind. Although this has never happened, swing door trains are still not immune to fire. They are made of wood. Unless you are carrying a flint and steel or a fire charge, I doubt there is any issue. The sad truth is that one person did carry a flint and steel, and it was used on one of the preserved carriages a few years ago. Swing door trains will never run again, but fire aside, these trains also had a massive service life, though not as long as the Tate set. The next train to enter service was the Harris train. The Harris train marked a radical difference in design because the livery was a slightly different colour. Harris trains honestly are pretty dry. They set the current speed limit of 115 kilometers an hour, which trains never get to anyway, except for our outer suburban areas. They are also the first steel train to enter service. Speaking of that, Harris trains entered service in the 1950s. Not that anyone asked. Unfortunately, there was a dark secret about these trains. A dark secret that led to the fate of them. Every time riders boarded the Harris train was a lottery and first prize was asbestos. For the safety of passengers, the trains were wrapped in plastic. Not to keep them fresh, but because the trains were to be taken to tips in southeast Melbourne. A sad end to a train no one cared about. However, the Harris carriages that didn't have asbestos would find themselves being upgraded to new trains and carriages, which I'll get to shortly. A fifth of a century later, the next train was to enter service. Called the Hitachi train, they were the first train to enter service naked, no livery whatsoever. If you might be thinking that these trains were manufactured by Hitachi, then you are wrong. They just ran out of ideas. The Hitachi trains were brought in to finally replace the swing door trains, which are aging worse than Yunan's Botox. On the inside, they looked like the 70s in a nutshell. Faux timber and awkward brown seats with a checker pattern. Fortunately, checkmate would come for these trains in just 30 years, for the most part. It wasn't that they were simply old. Well, they were often cramped and didn't have air conditioning, so ventilation was abysmal. People would pass out from being out of breath in these bloody things. It was no surprise why they were withdrawn so soon, compared to many other trains in Melbourne, but to this day still haunt the Newport workshops where they lay in storage. To those of you who aren't locals, Newport Workshops is a large facility where trains are manufactured, stored, and manufactured again. It's also a museum. Technology was to do its thing as the next fleet of trains were to enter service. In 1981, Comenge trains entered service. They were named after their manufacturer, Commonwealth Engineering, Comenge for short. The doors now beep, and they, like all doors prior, needed to be opened manually, but Comenge trains were special because it was the first time someone cared. At the start of the Comenge lifespan, they were internally similar to the Hitachi, which is acceptable because the Comenge is good overall, but Comenge trains were to get a life extension refurbishment, which I will get to soon because there is a life extension refurbishment I need to mention first. Remember the Harris train? If you don't, that's okay. Someone thought they could use a life extension refurbishment, and Comenge got awarded the contract. So what was the problem? Called Grey Ghosts, the trains were pretty much overhauled. On the outside, they were made to look like a less ugly version of their past selves, but a light grey livery was chosen, and to a degree it worked. The news reported less people vomiting on the spot of the new train. Inside the train was made to look like any other Comenge train, so there's not much to complain about, but the problem was that the trains are heavier after refurbishment, and they couldn't go up steep hills without rolling back down like that one roller coaster everybody hates. This restricted their use to the flattest lines on the network, two of which were closed soon after the Grey Ghost entered service. So the Grey Ghost project was cancelled and more Comenge trains were ordered instead. Eventually in the 90s, there was some interest in double-deck trains in Melbourne, along with hijacking the freshwater class ferries from Sydney. As a society, we're sick of hearing Sydney this, Sydney that. They're just so fucking special. We wish we were special. But we're creeps. Creeps who took a Tangara train and Frankensteined it for Melbourne, changing its electrical guts and loading gauge, which means to non-trainiacs and giga nerds, it's the outline of the front of the train. Don't know if I said that before. It was probably in the Harris train section, which for the same people they all skipped. The train was called the 4D, and it was a steaming pile of shit. It broke down more than every other train in Melbourne or Sydney combined. The new state-of-the-art train could only run in the eastern suburbs. To any local nerds who want me to specify real bad, the Belgrave and Lilydale lines. This is because the new bi-level train needed more height clearance than all the other lines. Other than the changes to the train to make it not a Tangara train, it's pretty much a Tangara. The train ran coupled with a Comenge train, which didn't matter anyway because everyone wanted to be in the 4D. The train was kept in service for a decade but was kidnapped and put away for 4 years. Finally, the train was brutally murdered and the parts were used for Tangara trains, which makes us all wonder, what part was used for T69? We might never know. But we do know that Melbourne will never get double-deck trains again, and Sydney will continue to laugh in our faces. Okay, back to the Comenge trains. They were from the 80s and had 3 different braking types, because they really couldn't make up their mind. Tread brakes, disc brakes, and a third one no one cares about. That largely didn't matter at the start of midlife, but at the end of the 90s it would matter. At Jeff Kennett's birthday, he bared the cake of public transport and took a knife to it, with 2 operators, Connex and M-Train, getting half of the cake each. Seemed like M-Train got the shit half with all the Santanas, because Connex got the first choice of the Comenge fleet. Like the selfish assholes they were, they chose all the later build sets that had all the disc brakes. Early built sets had tread brakes, which is fine, but later built sets had disc brakes. Apparently disc brakes were better. I personally couldn't give a shit, but it rippled out. Connex and M-Train were ordered to refurbish the trains, and they did different refurbishments. M-Train got it done locally at an unknown factory. EDI, now called Downer, were actually responsible for doing the job. Connex were built different, and they wanted their trains to be built different, so they sent them to a place called Ballarat. If you don't know Ballarat, that's okay, no one else does. Alstom did the refurbishment for them, and they look very different to the EDI refurbished trains. On the inside and out, some of the more noticeable changes, apart from braking, was the sound changes. I hope you enjoyed a sound that wasn't me yapping. You'll hear them more, keeping in mind that the Tate, Harris, Swing Door, Hitachis, and Grey Ghosts were all preserved examples and they couldn't move. Except for the Tate set, but I couldn't be bothered chasing after a heritage run. The other major differences on the inside are the different coloured handrails and different PIDs. If you don't know what PIDs means, it means Passenger Information Display System. In layman's terms, it's the screens in the train that say now arriving at Hoppers Crossing. Also, the speakers. On EDI refurbished trains, there are very basic dot matrix displays that come from the original refurbishment. Speakers on the train are very muffled and unclear, like the person making it was 10 kilometers underwater going through a Macca's drive-thru while being smothered by a blanket. In other words, pretty bloody unclear. The Connex refurbished trains also had a very basic dot matrix, even worse than the other one, but these trains were refurbished again by Alstom, receiving new crisp sound systems and new LCD PIDs. They look much better than the old Stone Age dots. The new LCD PIDs aren't bad, keeping in mind what they're replacing. They show next station and static and the route of not climbing stations like Sydney Metro, but I'm bloody finished talking about Sydney. Comenge are also the last fleet to have 2x3 seating arrangements for the suburban network. It mightn't be the best for accessibility, but it's certainly better for capacity. It seats dozens more people than the newer trains, which are made for the 16 people that are in a wheelchair. It goes without saying that Comenge trains are good ass, but they won't be sticking around for long. Like all other trains before them, they're being withdrawn. The process has already started. A lot of Comenge trains are gone already, particularly the tread brake ones, the EDI refurbished. The Alstom refurbished ones are still going pretty strong. Long live the Comenge train. In 2002, enough was enough for the Hitachi trains, and the private operators Connex and M-Train were ordered to replace the now ancient fleet. Connex reached out to Frog's Legs, occasionally known as Alstom, to make the trains, but really cheap since Connex was saving to get an Xbox in the office. Called Extrapolis trains, they were manufactured in Ballarat, the second fleet to be made there, apart from the Alstom refurbished Comenge. Extrapolis trains looked about as futuristic as they could for 20 years ago, having buttons to open the doors, and probably the best acceleration and deceleration sounds on the network, except for the Comenge. Extrapolis trains have much better accessibility, having more wheelchair spaces, handrails and longitudinal seating. In other words, cripples, pregnant bitches and old people can now use the train easily. Another major step to complying with Disability Discrimination Act standards. But Extrapolis silver lining ends where the shit stains begin. The suspension is arse. Literally everybody trips over because the train has springs instead of that other shit that all other trains use. The new Millennium could have done better, but it was 20 years ago. They didn't care how many old ladies would fall over, and they still do. Anyway, onto the looks of the train. It stood the test of time with its porthole windows and sliding doors in the gangway. Almost like Sydney, but we'll do better with meter rolling stock. We will. The interior, aside from its accessibility and futuristic shit, with its bright green handrails, it's got far more advanced PIDs. For the first time in Melbourne history, there was clear announcements and bright orange dot matrix displays over the carriage ends and exterior of the train. The seat fabric is still old as shit and still has the letters to spell Connex hidden in plain sight of millions of livestock that take Extrapolis trains. These trains also service as the most lines of any train. With the exception of the Comenge train, which ran network-wide, literally every other fleet has been limited to at least part of the network, but Extrapolis trains run on the Belgrave, Lilydale, Alamein, Glen Waverley, Hurstbridge, Mernda, Frankston, Whitby and Williamstown lines, also Flemington Racecourse. That's a fucking mouthful to say, but locals would say the Burnley, Clifton Hill and Cross City group. If you aren't a local and don't understand this, Burnley and Clifton Hill groups is talking about the first junctions of the lines, like groups of lines. The Cross City group is the only group of lines that actually runs through the city, but that's a topic for another video. As for the Extrapolis train, the actual deployment on the network is limited to just those lines. But anyway, I could talk about Extrapolis trains almost indefinitely, but we'll move on. While Connex asked the Frogs to make the trains for them, M-Train asked another company to make their trains, Siemens Mobility. Like Connex, their budget was cut to the bare naked bone, so Siemens had to take some concessions in the design and execution. For starters, the trains had only 2 doors on each side of the carriage compared to 3 doors on literally all the other suburban fleets from the Harris train onwards. This makes the dwell time of the train much longer, the time it has to spend on the platform letting people get on and off. Siemens trains also had some pretty bloody serious braking problems. Just like Bambi on ice, these trains slipped on their asses and overshot the platforms. They missed so many platforms it wasn't even funny. After fuck all time, these trains needed to be withdrawn and modified with sanders just to get them to work. Other than that, they were good as, like equally as good as the Extrapolis train. Inside they had bright yellow handrails and even better accessibility than the Extrapolis train, with longitudinal seats being replaced by fully accessible wheelchair spaces, and sliding doors in the carriages are now gone. The train is now fully accessible and the suspension is now airbags instead of springs, so no more old ladies trip over. The seats on the Siemens trains are different to all other fleets. There is next to no padding, and the print shows many places served by the Melbourne suburban fleet, including places that haven't been served by Siemens trains like Preston, Alamein, Mitcham and even Rockbank, a place that's not served by suburban trains at all, let alone Siemens trains. So bloody interesting to see all these places, and I'm sure a lot of commuters were tempted to look for their local station on their own seat. Sure as hell beat the 20-year-old Connex seats. Siemens trains run on the lines the Extrapolis trains don't run, those being Upfield, Craigieburn, Sunbury, Sandringham, also Werribee, Williamstown and Frankston. The Sunbury, Craigieburn and Upfield lines are all part of the Northern Group, and Werribee, Williamstown and Frankston lines are part of the Cross City Group, and Sandringham doesn't have one. To anyone on the Sandringham line affected by this, I would like to deeply apologise from the bottom of my heart that PTV has ostracised your line from the former Caulfield Group. Train line discrimination hurts everyone, and I found this out firsthand when I had to wait an hour for my train on a Saturday night. We push through it, even if it slowly chips away at our mind. They say we're fine, but we're not. We're not fine. The Rich Glen Waverley line won't stop this merciless discrimination. Having come this far, having this line so precious but fragile, if you live on the Sandringham line or any other underprivileged line, know that we're all in this together and you can always talk to people. Railway group discrimination hurts everyone, remember that. Now back to the program. Lines, seat fabric and accessibility aside, there is still more to say about the interior of the train. There are still more transverse seats in the Extrapolis train, and the doors are wider than older trains. But the last point of interest is the PIDs. Siemens train's legacy PIDs were a green dot matrix display with a unique sound system and voice. Well, you'll have to go out to hear it. Maybe I'll cover Sunshine. The government felt the need to replace the legacy PIDs with a new shiny LCD screen. Some like the new PIDs, but looks like vomit and it loses all of its character, but the Siemens train is so good that you have to let it slide. Like the extrapolis train, Siemens trains have stood the test of time, past, present, and emerging. It's not like I hot wrote this whole ass script for nothing. There is one final train on the suburban network, and it's called the High Capacity Metro Train, or HCMT, or occasionally These trains are the newest on the network. These fancy schmancy things were made in China, like everything else in the world, and the CRRC were the company to do it. They do make the rolling stock for Hong Kong's rail network and some shit over in the States. These trains were assembled at Newport workshops and are the perfect bookend for the suburban trains. These trains were designed to be used in the metro tunnel, which is a 9-kilometre hole in the ground that HCMT trains will run through. Only HCMT trains. These trains are a hell of a lot longer than all the other suburban trains, being 7 carriages long and possibly extended to 10 in the future. Pretty bloody long, it's longer than Sydney Metro. The trains themselves look really fancy, especially on the front, which was solely to prevent train surfing, the national sport of fare evaders. It's a fab where they ride on the front or back of the train on the outside because they can't be bothered touching on their bloody Mikey. Unlike the Siemens train, these trains have 3 doors on each side, so the problem with dwell time has been solved. But these doors are not off the hook. They are touch sensitive, meaning that if you even fairy tap the door, it'll open, and it can't even be pressed. The accessibility is still even better on the HCMT, with more wheelchair, bike and pram spaces, and they double as seating, having snug but clever longitudinal seating and near the gangways and even more spaces in some carriages. The transverse seats are higher back, designed for the long lines they serve, those being the Pakenham Cranbourne lines, the Dandenong group. Once the metro tunnel opens, they'll run through with the Sunbury line. Even though the seats have higher backs, they still have no padding, and they're worse than the shit in the waiting room we've all had to sit in. Apart from the discomfort of the seats, these trains look and feel like an evolution of the common-engine Siemens trains, with a distinct Melbourne feel and the evolution of Siemens accessibility. There's a lot more to say about HCMTs, and all the other trains for that matter, but there are more trains than just the electric suburban fleet. Greater regional Victoria is unelectrified and served by diesel trains. There are only 4 in service today. Prior to the 80s, the entire network was run down and just absolutely shithouse. Only a select few stations were even presentable, those probably being Ballarat, Bendigo, Castlemaine and Maryborough. There were a few more, but a lot of the stations just looked like shit, and the rolling stock reflected the state of the network, especially long distance lines to Swan Hill, Echuca, Albury, Shepparton, Bairnsdale and Warrnambool in the former Mildura line. In 1981 there was this new deal called the New Deal. They couldn't be bothered coming up with a better name, but it didn't matter because the New Deal was going to bring more rolling stock to the dying network. These were to be N-class locomotives and N-class carriages, as well as upgrading in 1950s B-class locomotives into A-class locomotives and T-class locomotives into P-class locomotives. Even some of the former Harris train carriages to be converted into locomotive haul carriages for intercity and interurban services. And there was also going to be a fleet of intercity commenge trains for the only electrified regional line in Victoria, that was the Traralgon line, but that didn't happen because they thought it would be easier to de-electrify the line to Pakenham. But ultimately, the New Deal was the saving grace of the regional rail network. N-class locomotives and carriages were built brand new in Somerton by Clyde Engineering. They entered service in the 1980s and ran network-wide. The first service actually ran to Ballarat, but it did the job, even if they're designed to be long distance. And they're still used at the time of riding for peak time runs to Geelong. There were 3 carriages in the original N-sets, an ACM, which was the first class carriage with the conductor's compartment at the end. These carriages have the most comfy seats, which are reversible, but unfortunately not anymore. The next carriage is a BRM, which is an economy class carriage with a buffet. The buffet was revolutionary because rather than people getting shitty overpriced pies and heated up cuppas at the station refreshment rooms, now they could do it on the train. Okay, the microwave pies and cuppas were not really that overpriced, and they're not that bad, but it was still really good for its time. All carriages except for the ACN have a 2x3 seating arrangement, which somewhat diminishes accessibility, but what can you do? The third carriage is called the BN and is entirely economy seating. The N-class carriages can be distinguished for their power-operated doors, like the Commons trains, and unique button-operated sliding doors between carriages, seating, and gangways. In the early days, there was just 3 carriages that ran services, but it was decided a few years later that more carriages were needed to make the trains longer. But they couldn't be bothered building any more carriages, so they took some Stone Age carriages from the 1950s called Z-Class carriages and upgraded them with the N-Class carriages and just rebranded them. These carriages were called the BZN and BTN. The BZN was another economy carriage with an accessible bathroom, and the BTN was just economy seating. Unlike the first 3 carriages, the BZN and BTN don't have button-operated sliding doors. Instead, they just have manual sliding doors between carriages and regular-ass doors in the seating areas. The seats are very comfortable and there's lots of them. One of the good things about N-sets going long distances and having a lot of patronage. There's many people that travel there that you can have a chat with. You never know if your best mate might be sitting in the next carriage. There are a few spots behind you in line for the buffet. It's about the journey sometimes. I mean, just look at the great rolling plains of the state outside the window. The Swan Hill and Warrnambool lines are the best views of the land. Both lines leave Coronation and travel through places you might see only once or twice in your lifetime. If you're like me, N-sets are very nostalgic, especially if you've travelled on them regularly. This applies to all trains. Along with the N-sets, there was a solution for interurban trips like Bacchus Marsh and Geelong. The now prehistoric Harris carriages, which served no purpose to the suburban network, were upgraded to a new locomotive-hauled interurban carriages. Called H-sets, these trains come from the 80s and were also part of the New Deal. Like the N-sets, they did the job, but not as well. H-sets were limited to the interurban area, and they were just useless for long distances. They were used for runs to Shepparton, which was pretty uncomfortable, but let's be real, no one would go to Shepparton anyway. The H-sets also had a 2x3 seating arrangements, but with some accessible longitudinal seating near the bathrooms. There's not much else to say about these trains. They're a solid fleet that served the network well, and they will continue to as they're withdrawn. One of the reasons for their withdrawal is because new rail cars have displaced the P-class locomotives, the ones that were designed specifically and upgraded specifically for hauling H-sets. Because H-sets have through cabling, these locomotives were usually in push-pull configuration to move the fat-ass carriages. Without the P-class locomotives, they'd need to be hauled by N-class locomotives. These big boys don't need to be in push-pull configuration, but they do need to run around the carriages, which makes the carriages very tired. It also restricts long-distance services, because there's literally less locomotives to go around. But the P-class locomotives were not at the end of their practical lives, they were just withdrawn anyway, which brings us to our second last lead in the video, the Sprinter. Even after the New Deal, the network was still run down like crazy. And there was mention of a new rail car for the regional network, but the locomotives and carriages were prioritised. In the 1990s, there was a really big need for rail cars, and they recognised it, and a company called Gunainen made the rail cars. Also, for anyone who doesn't know what a rail car is, it's a carriage with a diesel engine in it, so it's basically its own locomotive. Sprinters are weird and kind of fucked. They come from a time when peak patronage could be consolidated into a single carriage, so Sprinters were literally one-car trains that could run alone. But they could also loco-roco into much longer trains of up to 6 cars, but they didn't do it in their infancy in early years. 1, 2 and 3 cars was standard. Any less than it wouldn't work, and any more you're just dreaming. I couldn't sadly get many photos of the interior because the train kept giving me bloody jump scares every time I went near it. Seriously, Sprinter trains are so fucking obnoxiously loud, especially the horn. I wouldn't be surprised if people got conductive hearing losses from those bloody things. Deafness aside, sprinters ran in service for much of the intercity network, like Geelong, Bendigo, and that other place no one thinks about. Might or might not be Ballarat. As newer cars, rail cars from the new millennium became common, these trains were limited to interurban services, but now run on the Seymour line. It's the least used intercity line because no one really cares about Seymour or the towns between Seymour and Melbourne. Around the time of the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, 2006, sprinters were coupled into much longer than 2 or 3 carriages. They could be like 6, which wasted a hell of a lot of space because there was 10 intermediate drivers' cabins, which, there was only 22 sprinter carriages ever made, so running 3 trains of 6 carriages as well, times tables, it's a lot. Later rail cars would soon make the sprinters redundant. Hell, sprinters are already redundant. They're only in service because they're not technically at the end of their practical lifespan, but they are. They're shit, inefficient, loud, outdated rail cars that don't belong in our network day and age. Sprinters belong in the 60s on the most remote branch of the network, not goddamn intercity and interurban services. With that, it's time to move on to the real meat of the regional fleet. In the 90s, while we were wasting money on sprinters, regional New South Wales was investing in modern 2-car rail cars called Endeavours. They ran across the unelectrified regional network, while some were upgraded with a third intermediate carriage, meaning that the train could push even further into the regional area. The later 3-car trains were called Explorers. Explorers do runs like Sydney to Canberra and similar distance stuff. Endeavours and Explorers continued to serve regional New South Wales, but Victoria realised their mistake and got jealous, so we designed an even better rail car just to one-up them on intercity services, like Ballarat, Geelong, Bendigo and Traralgon. Called Velocity trains, they were built from the early 2000s to the time of writing. All the early sets had 2 cars, but will be paired to up to 6-car trains, and you know your times tables, so you know how many trains there was. There was only one problem with the Velocity trains. They're arse, but the state government didn't give a fuck, because they made several deals with Bombardier, later swallowed up by Alstom, to make these trains cheap and easy at Dandenong. It was also flexed by the government that these trains could do 160 k's, or 100 miles for anyone who doesn't know the metric system. 160 is an improvement over older locos and rail cars, which did 115 as a maximum, but Velocity trains actually can do 200, and it did it in testing, but the public isn't good enough for the privilege of trains that are actually fast. All the intercity lines were rebuilt for these trains at this new speed. Running time on the Geelong line was helped, but also hindered when the regional rail link was opened, which is the Victorian version of the Epping to Chatswood rail link. It connected 2 places that really needed it, and the regional rail link connected Little River, a place near Werribee, the suburban terminus, and Deer Park, an intermediate station on the Ballarat line, making Deer Park an interchange station and also separating Geelong from the Werribee line. New tracks were built from Sunshine, so the train was completely separated from the Sunbury line. The Ballarat line was made faster by the rebuild, but still took its sweet-ass time when going around the Werribee Gorge. But a lot of time savings were nullified when the intermediate stations were built between Melton and Deer Park. These new stations might be a part of the Western Rail Plan, a project to electrify the regional rail link and the Ballarat line up to Melton to send new HCMT trains along these new lines, joining them up with the Sunbury and Airport lines at Sunshine, which would make a pretty good interchange station, probably better than Chatswood, Wallay Creek and Parramatta combined. But being Melbourne, this grand-ass plan would never happen. Anyway, back to the Velocity train. These trains were the first of the regional fleet to have a 2x2 seating arrangement, which decreases the capacity a lot and forces people to stand. We aren't very patient people, and when we're on the trains, they take over an hour, sometimes 2 hours. We want a bloody seat, it's not rocket science. The 2 end cars have bathrooms, only one of them is accessible, which is still an improvement over the old fleets. The NSETs had only one accessible space near an accessible bathroom in only the BZN carriage. H-sets had slightly more accessible space. 2 out of the 3 cars had accessible bathrooms and seating, and sprinters didn't even have functional bathrooms at all. The Velocity train was a huge improvement in accessibility, but especially in the middle carriage, which all sets now have regardless of their age. In theory, Velocity trains seem like a good idea. They're accessible, fast, and locally built, so what's the problem? Velocity trains, to start, are uncomfortable. The seats have fuck all padding and they're worse than that office chair we've all waited in. The seats are fine for the interurban area, but they ain't that good for long distances. And once you travel somewhere further, like the Ballarat line, the discomfort of the seats is more noticeable. It's like your ass goes to sleep. You get used to it, but once you get off, you notice it. Even further than Ballarat, like Bendigo or Traralgon, it ain't just your ass that goes to sleep, but everywhere is somehow in pain, and the pain increases the further you travel. Maryborough and Ararat are bad, but it's a whole new problem. Velocity trains should never have left the interurban area. It's not just the seats. Being a railcar means that you have a running diesel engine under your feet. The feel of a vibrating engine only amplifies the discomfort of the seat, and the sound of the engine is just absolutely sickening, but not nearly as bad as the sprinters, which might have been worse. It's not bad going to Geelong, and Velocity trains are by far the best fleet for the Geelong line, but the government can't take the time to realise that the rest of the network deserves something better than the Geelong line trains. And Ballarat and Bendigo don't have it too bad compared to some other places. A few years ago, 100% of the long distance trains fleet was NSETs. They were designed for long distances and suit long distance commuters and other passengers very well. But since then, Shepparton line has been 100% replaced by Velocity trains. Maryborough and Ararat were quick to go, and the Bairnsdale line is mostly Velocity trains with 1 NSET return per day. The Echuca line has recently been completely replaced, leaving only the Swan Hill and Warrnambool lines run by NSETs. NSETs are on their last legs, and they've already been testing Velocity trains on the Warrnambool line, and the replacement is right around the corner, but they seem to be hanging on in Swan Hill. Swan Hill line is the longest line in the network and highest duration, taking the better part of 5 hours. A long time to be in a confined space, largely bound to your seat, but the buffet is still what gets people to stand up. Food on the train should not be a luxury, but it now is. Combining long distances and Velocity trains doesn't end well. Passengers are tired, uncomfortable, and hungry. If you've ever made it through a trip to Echuca and back, you deserve a bloody gold medal. The government has a silver bullet solution for only the Albury line. Since the Albury line is standard gauge, meaning that the track is a slightly different width, they converted an NSET to its gauge for the runs to Albury. The government thought they had a solution for replacing it, a standard gauge Velocity fleet. New fast 6-car trains going to Albury every 4 hours. It seemed almost too good to be true, and the rural communities loved the idea. The new trains would have more storage space, USB charging ports on every single seat, and it would still retain the buffet. It seemed too good. This is where it all goes to shit. The line was not rebuilt for high-speed trains, so the limit was only changed marginally. The new storage space was an advantage, but there was still plenty of space on the NSETs. The charging ports and the 6-car train part still is good. They're massive improvements for long distances, but the buffet didn't change from the previous fleet, except for now it has LCD displays for the menus and bright yellow handrails. I still have a problem with them. The seating hasn't changed. It's still loud and uncomfortable to travel on, and there's actually been some transverse seats taken out and replaced with longitudinal seats. To spell it out to the government, people don't want to spend 4 or 5 hours sitting sideways. It's unnatural, disorienting, and impractical to assign people to sideways seats on long distances. These long distance Velocity trains are built better than the regular ones, but only for the Albury line. It seems like only that line's just going to get the good ones. It's clear that they want to do a 100% Velocity fleet for all of regional Victoria, but they must take the time to let the Velocity train evolve. There needs to be a dedicated long-distance intercity and interurban fleet, which are all fitted exactly for that distance. Once they've done that, then maybe they're out of the blue. It's important to know that a trip to Shepparton is different to Ararat, which is different to Traralgon, which is different to Geelong. It might be inevitable that moving on means that older trains die out, which is still copying New South Wales Endeavours and Explorers, which themselves don't cover 100% of their network. Their step up is the XPT, 5 or 6 car train with power cars on each end. This model of having power cars rather than separate locomotives and carriages is even better, and the XPT has many similarities with NSETs. And they were made by the legendary rolling stock manufacturer Commonwealth Engineering, Comeng. Who knows what will happen to the regional network, or the suburban network? Only time will tell. Whether velocity trains take over the network, like Commonwealth and Hitachi trains did on the suburban network, or something else. The end of the line is approaching for the N sets, and it's already came for the H sets on Friday 2nd February 2024. H sets were really Harris trains, and they've stood the test of time, even to this day. They're a fleet that went well past its time, even after its purpose-built P-class locomotives were retired. Each and every fleet in this video deserves a future video, along with the Western Rail Plan, Metro Tunnel, and Ballarat and Geelong lines all deserve videos in the future. But I have to draw the line because my arm's getting really sore writing the script. Cheers.